There is a common and comforting story we tell ourselves about the past. It suggests that history is a distant country, a place of closed chapters and settled accounts. People often say that slavery is ancient history, an unfortunate episode that is now firmly over. They insist that the books have been closed, the debts paid, the world has moved on. This narrative is a convenient fiction. It is a story designed to soothe the present by sanitizing the past. The stark truth is that the wealth generated by the brutal machinery of slavery did not simply evaporate when the last chains were broken. It endured, transformed, and became embedded in the very foundations of the modern world we inhabit today. The echoes of that era are not faint whispers. They are loud and clear in the financial districts, grand institutions, national treasuries of the Western world. To dismiss the economic legacy of slavery is to misunderstand the nature of wealth itself. Wealth is not static. It flows, it compounds, it builds upon itself. The capital extracted from the bodies of enslaved African men, enslaved African women, enslaved African children was reinvested, laundered through generations, ultimately became the bedrock upon which significant portions of modern economies were constructed. This is not a matter of ancient history. It is a matter of inherited advantage structures that persist, a story that remains profoundly unfinished and unspoken in our public memory. We must therefore approach this subject not as a closed case, but as an active investigation into our collective inheritance. It requires us to look beyond the horrifying images of plantation slave ships, as essential as they are, and to trace the money. We must follow the profits as they moved from the sugar fields of the Caribbean to the counting houses of London, from the cotton plantations of the American South to the textile mills of Manchester, from the auction blocks of Charleston to the nascent banks of New York. The story of slavery is not just a story of human suffering. It is also a story of immense, calculated, enduring economic gain. To say that this wealth still matters is not an accusation designed to incite guilt, but a statement of demonstrable fact. It is a call to look at the world as it is, and to ask how it came to be this way. Why did certain nations rise to global dominance in the 18th and 19th centuries? How were their industrial revolutions financed? Where did the seed capital for their most powerful corporations and financial institutions come from? The answers to these questions are complex, but any honest accounting must acknowledge the central and undeniable role that the exploitation of African people played in this global economic transformation. To understand the scale of this enterprise, we must name its principal architects. The transatlantic slave trade was not a rogue operation conducted by a few pirates. It was state-sponsored, it was legally sanctioned, it was nationally vital to Europe's maritime empires. Portugal was the pioneer initiating the trade on the West African coast in the 15th century. Portugal became the single largest transporter of enslaved Africans, primarily to Brazil. The Portuguese crown and its merchants dominated the South Atlantic for centuries, creating a brutal, highly profitable system shaping two continents. They set the template others expanded upon. Great Britain, a later entrant, became the dominant slave-trading nation of the 18th century. British ships carried millions of Africans into bondage. Profits and goods from enslaved labor lubricated Britain's industrial revolution. Liverpool, Bristol, Glasgow. Spain was a major recipient of enslaved people. Cuba, mainland American colonies. Early silver and gold were supplemented by profits from sugar tobacco. France built Saint-Domingue into the Pearl of the Antilles, relying on the labor of roughly 500,000 enslaved people. Wealth from sugar and coffee enriched Nantes, Bordeaux, La Rochelle, and filled French state coffers. The Netherlands acted as traders, financiers, and shippers, running plantations in Suriname and facilitating trade. Denmark participated, Sweden participated. The newly formed United States later became a major force. Though the international trade was outlawed in 1808, a massive internal slave trade flourished, moving hundreds of thousands from the Upper South to the Deep South. The American economy, North and South, was deeply entangled with slavery. Southern cotton fed northern textile mills. Northern banks financed southern plantations. This was a national economic engine. These nations were not passive observers. They were the active drivers and primary beneficiaries of a system of mass human exploitation. For centuries, they labored on sugar plantations, in gold mines, on coffee plantations. Brazil's immense colonial wealth and its social structure were built on enslaved African labor. The system's devastation is clear in the compensation paid at abolition. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, the government borrowed to pay £20 million, and that payment went to 46,000 slave owners, not the enslaved. An honest accounting of the slave trade requires acknowledging its full complexity, which includes the participation of certain African and Arab actors. To ignore their role is to present an incomplete history. On the West African coast, powerful states and coastal polities emerged that became deeply involved in the transatlantic trade. Dahomey, the Asante Empire, the Oyo Empire, Wider, Alada, Porto Novo. They engaged in warfare and raiding to capture people from the interior. They then traded these captives to European merchants at coastal forts in exchange for textiles, alcohol, metalware, and crucially, firearms, which further fueled the cycle of violence and conquest. This participation was often a matter of political and economic survival in a region radically transformed by the European presence. The demand for enslaved labor created immense pressure. States that refused to participate often found themselves at a military and economic disadvantage compared to their rivals. This historical fact, however, must be handled with great care and context. It must never be used as a tool to excuse or diminish the primary role of European imperial power. The European nations created the massive transatlantic market, provided the capital and the ships, and controlled the entire system from a global perspective. They set the terms of the trade and were its ultimate and largest beneficiaries. When slavery was officially abolished, the vast fortunes it had created did not vanish into thin air. Wealth, especially on that scale, has a powerful inertia. It was passed down through families, reinvested in new ventures, and absorbed into the institutional fabric of nations. The profits from sugar, cotton, tobacco became the capital that built the modern world. It is a fundamental error to imagine that this economic legacy ended with emancipation. Instead, it transformed, taking on new forms that continue to shape the distribution of wealth and opportunity in the 21st century. The money is not gone. It is simply harder to see, hidden in plain sight, within the structures of our economies. Consider the path of this inheritance. The money paid in compensation to British slave owners was not buried in the ground. It was invested in railways, factories, and the expansion of the British Empire. Family fortunes built on Caribbean sugar or American cotton were used to purchase land, build grand houses, and establish businesses that exist to this day. Barclays Lloyds have historical links to financing the slave trade or compensating owners. Esteemed universities, Harvard, Yale, and Oxford, have acknowledged that their early endowments were funded in part by donors whose wealth derived from slavery. This is the tangible, material legacy of the system. This inherited advantage is the silent dividend of historical injustice. The nations that grew richest from the slave trade did not start from the same economic baseline as the nations they exploited. The enormous injection of capital from centuries of unpaid labor gave them a monumental head start in industrialization and global economic dominance. This process created a profound and lasting global inequality. The wealth accumulated in Europe and North America through the exploitation of Africa and the African diaspora directly corresponds to the wealth that was extracted and prevented from developing in Africa itself. The prosperity of one was built on the plunder of the other. Facing this truth is not about assigning personal blame to living individuals for the sins of their distant ancestors. It is about recognizing a structural reality. It is about historical and economic clarity. When we discuss wealth inequality today, both within nations and between them, we are remiss if we ignore its deepest historical roots. The patterns of poverty and privilege that we see around the world are not accidental. They are the downstream consequences of historical processes, and the transatlantic slave trade was one of the most significant and brutal of those processes. The story of the wealth built on black blood is not comfortable, but it is necessary. It demands that we look past simplistic narratives and confront the cold, hard numbers of economic history. The immense profits derived from the capture, transportation, forced labor became the jet fuel for the West's rise. The principal architects of this system, Portugal, Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, United States, did not just trade. They built empires and national economies on it. They called it trade. We call it what it was: organized theft of African life on a global scale. And the nations that rose from it cannot hide behind time, because their wealth still speaks.